Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak in opposition to the Abbott government's harsh and cruel cuts to the early childhood sector in this country, and I do so from a really fine record of the Labor government's achievement in this area. And in fact, the Labor government has been the only government in the history of childcare in this country to really look at not only access and affordability, but to look at quality education and care for Australia's young children, and in fact one of the most vulnerable age groups in our community, those children between the ages of 0 and 6 who attend long day care, family day care and out-of-school occasional care services in our country every working day of the week. And Labor's record is a proud record. We came to government with a policy about early childhood education and care. And one of the very first things the Labor government did was to increase affordability for families by taking the childcare rebate, the means-tested rebate, and increasing it from 30% to 50%. So Labor's record in terms of families using early childhood education and care is there on the record. But we didn't stop there. We went further. For the first time ever, not only did we promote the workforce participation of primary carers, and in this case usually women, but we looked at the brain development and what young children in early childhood education and care needed. And the academic research is very, very clear. The optimal brain development is in the first 3 years. And so Labor did a number of other things, and not only that, Labor did that in consultation with all of the states and territories and with the agreement of all sorts of different governments across this country who all agreed through the COAG process that it was time to really put a focus on early childhood education and care in this country. And not only did Labor do that in consultation with state and territory governments, but Labor went out and had community consultations across the country. Every state and every territory had a range of consultations during the day and evenings, so that the community, both educators, those working in the early childhood education and care sector, parents, owners and operators, were able to have their say about the sorts of reforms that Labor felt was necessary for the early childhood education and care sector in this country. And we did that through phasing in those changes. So one of the first things we did to take advantage of that early brain development was introduce an early years learning framework to standardise the sorts of development opportunities for early childhood centres to participate in across the country. And I'd have to say that I took part in those consultations, and they were really, really well received by the sector. The sector felt that the early years learning framework was something that would positively assist the development of the experiences that young children were receiving in early childhood centres. And Labor didn't stop there. We then embarked on looking at the ratios, because prior to Labor coming to government, if you were a carer in Tasmania compared to, say, a carer or an educator in Western Australia, and you were in the under-2s room, in Tasmania you were expected to care for 5 babies, 1 educator to 5 babies. So one of the things Labor did very early on was to standardise those ratios, because why should children in Tasmania have poor ratios when children in Western Australia were enjoying a ratio of 4 babies to 1 educator? And so, again, with the agreements of states and territories, Labor federally moved to reduce ratios, to improve them across the country. Again, consultation with the states and territories, consultation with the community, and a phased-in approach which is still going on as we speak. So Labor has a proud record when it comes to early childhood education and care in this sector. And what we know about early childhood education and care in this sector is that around 70% of centres are run by single operators or operators who operate 1 or 2 centres, and these are private operators. And around about 30% of the long day care sector is run by community organisations. And so we then turn to what the Abbott government, or when it was in opposition, looked to do in terms of a policy. Well, you'd have to look really hard, Mr Acting Deputy President, because it doesn't really have a policy. And in fact, what we saw was a lot of chatter, a lot of rhetoric by Mr Abbott when in opposition, and indeed from Susan Ley when she was the opposition spokesperson on early childhood education and care. And they seem to be focused on 2 areas. One is cost to families, and yes, cost to families should always be at the forefront of our considerations. But what the Abbott government did when in opposition was simply blame Labor. Blame Labor for increasing costs when it acknowledged that in fact it's a market. Childcare in this country is a market, and it's up to those single operators to determine the price. Interestingly, from a then opposition who seems to support private business, didn't seem to understand that childcare in our country is largely a private business, didn't seem to, again, in opposition and indeed in government, a government who promotes competition doesn't seem to promote competition in the early childhood space. In fact, just seems to ignore it. So the Abbott government, we saw, did 2 things. Doesn't have a comprehensive policy on early childhood education and care. It flicked early childhood education and care off to a productivity inquiry, so completely abrogated its responsibilities in relation to early childhood education and care in this country, flicked a report off to the Productivity Commission and asked the Productivity Commission to actually try and look at how to make childcare more accessible, how to make it more affordable. So, not quite sure why a government would abrogate its responsibilities to the Productivity Commission, but that's what it's done. A draft report is due out soon. The final report's due out sometime in October. But as we know, it's really up to the government when that report sees the light of day. And given October's getting towards the end of the year, I doubt, well, I'd like to be found wrong on this, but I doubt that report will see the public light of day until early next year, because the government doesn't actually have to do anything at all. The release of the final report is clearly in the government's camp. So let's see how long it will take them to release the final report. So that's one thing it did. The other thing, again prior to the election, that Mr Abbott did was to write to every child care service in the country complaining about the high cost of childcare. And yet what we've seen this government do in the budget is, for the first time in our history, for the first time in the history of early childhood education and care in this country, the government has attacked the childcare benefit. Now, the childcare benefit is paid to low-income families. It's a means-tested rebate to low-income families because, obviously, families right across our community need childcare to enable parents to go to work. But the government has chosen, for the first time ever, to cap the upper limit of the childcare benefit. Now, that will deliver a very significant saving to the government. And during Senate estimates, I tried to get some response from the government about what that money was going to be used for, that savings measure of over $200 million, and all they could tell me was it would go into general revenue into the childcare space, but had no targeted plan about helping very low-income families into childcare. Nothing, complete silence. And in relation to the affordability question, which the government for some strange reason has lumped on the Productivity Commission, it seems to, and you hear this in their rhetoric every day, that they like the Australian community to believe that somehow Labor failed to address the increasing costs of childcare, and somehow it was our fault. And the government is trying to paint a picture that it can control the costs of childcare, even though childcare is largely a private market in Australia. So I asked in Senate estimates one of the department officials, Miss Wilson, and she said, I quote, she said, "The market is the market. We do not intervene in the market." So here we have seemingly a direct contradiction from Mr Abbott, the Prime Minister, and Ms Ley, the Minister for Early Childhood, seeming to imply that somehow they can control the market, and yet their very own department in Senate estimates says very clearly that the department doesn't intervene in the market. So let's see what rabbit Mr Abbott pulls out of the hat once we get the Productivity Commission inquiry report sometime into the future. The other interesting piece about the productivity inquiry increase is that in opposition, Mr Abbott was very, very clear that he wanted to take the envelope that's currently available for childcare benefit and childcare rebate, and he wanted to ask the Productivity Commission how to stretch that envelope even further. Now, at the time, Labor warned that indeed doing that would mean that costs would increase for parents. Now, we don't even have the final Productivity Commission report. We don't know what ideas the Productivity Commission report is going to make, but we already see that the Abbott government is increasing costs for the users of childcare in our community by capping the childcare benefit. That means that as parents' income increases and they go beyond the cap, they'll no longer be eligible for childcare benefit. And the childcare rebate, the government has extended the cap on that. So there are huge savings that the Abbott government are making at the expense of working families in our country. And that's just got to be absolute hypocrisy, because we have a government that's got no plan for childcare, despite what it said in opposition, no plan at all, except what we've seen is its referral of the whole matter to the Productivity Commission. Well, then you'd have to ask, well, why didn't it wait? Why did the government choose during the budget to really hit working families through the changes it's made to the childcare benefit scheme and to the recapping of the childcare rebate? Because we will see market costs continue to increase in childcare, and we know NatSem has a report out this morning that shows that it's barely affordable for low-income families to work. And we had figures quoted of the primary caregiver, usually the woman, earning as little as $3.45 an hour. And it just demonstrates how critically important it is for both parents in a family to be working, or indeed one parent to be working, that women in the main are working for as little as $3.45 an hour, that they still need that very low hourly rate to contribute to trying to balance their family budgets. So in fact, what Mr Abbott has done has made it much harder for those families to make ends meet. Never mind all of the other harsh and cruel outcomes for families in the recent budget, the $7 GP tax, all of the other imposts that families are going to suffer in our country. The one area where we had some certainty, the government has now created uncertainty. For those low-income families, they will be very concerned about losing their childcare benefit, and for the childcare rebate just to not be able to sustain them for the whole 12 months that they need childcare. And the NatSem report goes even further. It reports, and this has been known for a while too, that the childcare rebate benefits those families at the top end of income scales, those who are more able to afford care. And what will this mean for families? Well, it means they'll probably cut back on using quality early childhood education and care, so vital for the development of their children. We'll see cutbacks. We may see a greater use of unregulated backyard care, and that is certainly not good for families and would be a terrible decision for working families to have to make. And I'm sure that we'll see, where grandparents are available, a greater impost on grandparents to take up the caring responsibilities. Is that the response of the Abbott government, to say to families, you're on your own? What I've heard in this place, I've heard the government say time and time again, it's a responsibility of states to provide education and health, and on it goes. Well, obviously the Abbott government has now taken that to a new low by saying to families, actually the responsibility for early childhood education and care is yours and yours alone, because we are interfering with how the childcare benefit rebates, and while we're at it, we're going to cap the childcare rebate. Right, doing this almost on the eve that the draft report of the Productivity Commission inquiry is due out. Now, why would a government do that? I think they do it for two reasons. One, they demonstrate very clearly their complete misunderstanding of the early childhood sector in this country, and two, they are so intent on making budget savings that they don't really care where they come from, because attacking the lowest paid in our community by this move on childcare benefit is really a disgraceful act. It is quite disgraceful and hypocritical too, given that the Productivity Commission, as we speak, is looking at accessibility of affordable care. What a mockery that is, when the Abbott government has now made care more expensive. Do we now have an addendum to the Productivity Commission? Oh, by the way, can you look at what we've done in the budget and include that in your recommendations? At the 11th hour, suddenly changing the whole of the Productivity Commission inquiry, because we've got a whole new rule applying to childcare benefit that the Productivity Commission may or may not have the time to take into account. But given the draft report is out shortly, I doubt that it's able to. And as I said, the Prime Minister personally wrote to all centres about the impact of capping the childcare rebate. That's something that Labor did, saying that it would mean increasing out-of-pocket costs for families. Yet in the budget we see that the Abbott government has done just that. What hypocrisy! What hypocrisy! To say on the one hand, before the election, so desperate to win votes that somehow they could control a market, which their own department says they can't, that they could somehow try and hoodwink parents, that they could control the costs. Well, parents know full well, because it's parents who are fronting up to services in this country every day of the week, who are forking out greater and greater amounts of out-of-pocket expenses thanks to the Abbott government. They know the truth. And if Mr Abbott and his minister, Ms Ley, won't come out and say the truth, well, families experiencing those rising costs will know every day of the week, will know very clearly who increased their out-of-pocket expenses, and they will know it is the Abbott government who, before the election, in a Hippocratic way, tried to pretend something quite different. Something quite different. So I don't know how long Australian families are going to have to wait before we see a comprehensive, detailed plan and policy from the Abbott government. Maybe never. Their record in this area is really, really poor. They went to the election with a promise they certainly could not keep, and we've seen an absolute breaking of that promise by this move on the childcare benefit, which will impact low-income families. And the Abbott government is no friend of families, that's for sure. Not only will they increase their childcare costs, but a whole range of things that families have taken for granted, such as visits to the doctor, will also increase. This is absolute hypocrisy from a government who clearly does not care about the early childhood education and care sector. Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President.
Senator Polley.